Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss increased demands for the government to carry out an economic impact report onto the effects of Brexit since January. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So in order for the government to be able to plan, they run economic impact assessments all the time, including on policy proposals. Even private businesses need to do this to manage their financial affairs. My partner works in such a role for the multinational company she works for. You need to be able to predict the economic impact of your decisions, as well as decisions or other events happening around you. And of course, the government do this as well. The Treasury are always running the figures based on changes in the country, in the wider world, changes that may arise from new legislation that's planned, regulations, policies in general. How will it impact our trade, both exports and imports? How will it impact interest rates, value of the pound, jobs growth, wage growth, inflation, and so on? Except Boris Johnson's government have been a little bit different. There are two major areas of policy, quite huge areas of policy, where economic impact assessments have been notably lacking: Brexit and the pandemic. Now, Theresa May's government ran the odd one for Brexit and then tried desperately to keep it under wraps because it was so horrific. But under Boris Johnson, there's a bit of a different plan. It's like, Prime Minister, you know, we can keep these things under wraps, but someone inevitably leaks it all. Well, I've got a cunning plan then, we just won't run the reports at all. So there hasn't been a single assessment carried out. For the biggest change to our trading arrangements in British history, not a single economic assessment has been carried out on the impacts of Brexit. Not before we left the EU, not during the transition period, and not since leaving the single market and customs union. And here's the thing. Let's imagine that you suppose the government are trying to manage the economy well. Let's say that despite the terrible damage that has been caused to our economy, which is way worse than for any other nation, particularly in Europe, who've also gone through with both Brexit and the pandemic, that it is actually a good job being done by the Prime Minister, yes I know, let's just imagine, against a background of severe difficulties. Let's just say you want to give Boris Johnson the benefit of the doubt. How on earth can you suppose that he or his government are able to make the right decisions without any forecasting at all? After all, they have forecasts for, say, the spread of coronavirus, always referring to charts of coronavirus spread, predictions as well as reality, with lots of different parameters considered as well. Why have they never once produced a chart for the economic forecasts of their COVID policies? Why have they never once published forecasts for the economic impact of Brexit? The reason is it would scare the hell out of the population. Former Chancellor Sajid Javid tried to excuse not carrying out these assessments by saying they're not really terribly reliable, are they? Which is absolute claptrap. If he didn't think they were terribly reliable, why did he run economic impact assessments for everything else? Why is it only Brexit assessments, particularly leaving the EU, that he wasn't carrying out? His department still carried out economic impact assessments for everything else, as they would, including post-Brexit trade deals that never actually managed to be worth more than 0%. And if you think a trade deal that's worth 0% is unambitious, like the US trade deal proposed, it's actually fantastic. It's a lot better than the ones we have that are worth -%, like, for example, the EU trade deal. The bottom line is that you cannot manage something as complex as the economy without forecasts. Long gone are supposed to be the days when we would consult a wizened old woman in possession of a bowl and some lizard entrails. Now, against a background of a government that keeps insisting that everything is fine. See, then what happens is figures are published that show that everything is very far from fine, like with January, and then the government changes their line to, yeah, okay, it wasn't fine then. I know we said it wasn't actually fine, you're quite right, but it's fine now, it was just teething troubles. They're just going to keep doing that, aren't they? So it's against this background that Labour now are stepping up their calls for an economic impact assessment, specifically of the EU Trading Cooperation Agreement. Now you may think, well, this is new. Labour has been a bit quiet on the old Brexit front. Too quiet if you ask me. But in truth, they have actually been attacking it on a weekly basis since the start of the year. It's just that those attacks have taken the form of shadow ministers like Emily Thornberry and Rachel Reeves asking awkward questions in Parliament, to which they've not really been getting any answers. Or senior backbenchers such as Yvette Cooper and Hilary Benn asking awkward questions in select committees, to which they've not really been getting any answers. Starmer gave it a kick in a couple of times in January, but nothing in PMQs. Not really much being said in interviews, meaning that it hasn't really hit the headlines. But now Rachel Reeves, who is Michael Gove's opposite number, is demanding that an assessment be made. She's received a letter from the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, which is an independent body that scrutinises government economic policy. The letter says that the figures continue to show that Brexit will cause, as expected and was long forecast, a 4% drop in productivity in the long term as a result of the trade barriers erected due to Boris Johnson's EU deal. There was a report on this in the Financial Times that had an interesting point from a John Springford from a think tank called Centre for European Reform. Now, I will say, I think people should be very wary of comments from think tanks. They all describe themselves as experts and independent. Quite often they're not actually experts in the thing they profess to be, or at least sometimes. But independent doesn't mean objective. That's not to say don't listen to them, but judge each statement on its merits. Consider it carefully, I would suggest. But Springford said that some of that loss in productivity comes from, for example, workers in the shellfish industry. Now, because a lot of them very few of them can sell to the EU, and a lot of them need to sell to the EU. So what happens is their market shrinks, workers end up moving out of the industry into less productive, lower paid activity. I mean, after all, if they had access to more productive, higher paid activity, they'd be doing that instead of the shellfish farming, wouldn't they? And I'll tell you what I find interesting about this. See, the government will always seek to frame anything in terms of how it best reflects on them. That's not a slight against the government. Any government would do that. This is why Benjamin Disraeli talked about lies, damned lies, and statistics. It's not that statistics are lies. It's just that very few people have the mathematical training to really read into them and to understand them and ask the right questions about them. You know, and so you can make a lot of misleading statements with stats because people ultimately, it's like reading a foreign language. It's like you showing someone like me who can't speak French a document in French and telling me it says this, and I'll just go, oh, all right, I'll take your word for it, I can't read it. It's the same with stats. The only difference is people think they can read stats. So the government may, for example, want to talk about jobs. Now, if employment remains at roughly the same level come the next general election, as it was just before Brexit, it may go down and then go back up again, they may claim that they've managed Brexit. After all, there's not been any job losses, but that would be to assume that each job has the same value. Well, you ask someone who's on £40,000 a year if moving to a job for £20,000 a year is the same thing. So we may ask, well, hang on a minute, what about average wages then? Taking inflation into account, how are they holding up? Because if a load of people move from relatively lucrative jobs to low paid ones as a result of Brexit, the overall number of jobs may be the same. But the benefit to the economy is less so because they're less productive jobs, and definitely the benefit to the people with those jobs, the general public, is certainly less so. Also, lower paid jobs means less disposable income, means less money being spent in local businesses and further away businesses, means small businesses go under. Then reasonably prosperous small business owners are getting themselves low paid work as well, or lower paid work, to make ends meet. Because here's the thing, look at this. I had to go at calculating a few economic figures, spent a bit of time here, looking at where the Conservatives were when they came to power in 2010, which was 2 years after a global financial crash. So they started off from a low base. The economy was low. Should have been easy to grow our wages after a decade from a low base. Oh, it's easy to improve anything from a low base. But a couple of figures I looked at here. They're all in US dollars. That's just the easiest way to get these data. No point trying to convert it. The exchange rate doesn't stay the same anyway. And it's comparative, so it doesn't matter what it's measured in. It could be measured in peanuts, makes no difference. Now, GDP per capita fell pretty badly when compared to where it should have been with inflation. So the figures are, on the left you can see what GDP per capita was year on year. And I've also got Labour's in there, I'll come to that. And then what you've got to the right of it is what it should have been starting from when they entered power, from when they took over government, based on inflation, if it kept in step with inflation. So from 2010 to 2019, GDP per capita was down after 9 years of Tory rule to the tune of 10.3%, compared with where, as I say, it should have been if it kept in step with inflation. Now, after 9 years of the last Labour government, it was 43.6% up. Now, sure, you'll be saying, but what happened after that? Yes, took an absolutely massive hit with the 2008 global crash. See, that's the thing about major global economic crashes. It done half cause trouble. But the point is that even after that, they still ended up 14.6% up on where they started. There was just 1 year during Labour's entire 13 years in power where there was not an above inflation increase in GDP per capita. It was 2001. But then let's look at GNI per capita. Now, this is a way better look at wealth distribution, say, because GDP is just how productive you are, how much productivity you add into the country. You don't necessarily share in that productivity. GNI is how much we basically made from it. On average, what were we making? That was 15.5% down on inflation based on what it would have been with inflation in 2019. So in other words, the Conservatives have given us, on average, a real terms pay cut of 15.5% in 9 years of power. So salaried workers have on average received in real terms 15.5% pay cut under the Tories in 9 years. In fact, you can actually see that the pay cut accelerated over the past few years, but it was down every year. And again, I will repeat, so this doesn't include their major global crash in the form of the pandemic. So basically Labour, after about 9 years, had a major global crash. Okay, the Conservatives, technically the same thing. 2020, they had 9.5 years in power, and then 2020, they had the major crash in the form of the pandemic. This hasn't been factored into that yet. You know, I can compare this with the last Labour government, where they were after the same 9 years in power, and they didn't take power under economic slump, by the way. The economy was doing all right when Labour took over in 1997. It was doing fine. It was growing. Very decent growth. But we had an average pay increase of 2.9%. And that's after the crash compared to inflation. Just before the crash. But after 9 years. Didn't end that way. It was an effective pay cut of 7.9% at the end of it, because that was after the global crash a couple of years later. But then 7.9% down is still way better than 15.5% pay cut that we've had since then. And that is without any external shocks to the system. That is without the Conservatives having to have had dealt with a major global crash. They have now, but we haven't got the data for those. Now that highlights two things. Year on the year, the Conservatives have given us a suppressed growth in GDP, Labour did not, and a suppressed growth in wages, Labour did not, in their first 9 years in power. The years we have the data for. The trend was also getting worse, so don't imagine that the next sets of data are going to look any good, even once we're past the pandemic. It'll never look good because they never have looked good. The second thing is it shows that GNI per capita spiraled completely out of control after the Brexit referendum, showing how damaging Brexit is to us personally. Also to the economy, because here's the thing, although the Conservatives were providing an average real terms pay cut every single year, GDP per capita, growth of the economy, which doesn't help workers if they don't get to share in that extra growth, but nonetheless, GDP per capita was increasing. Not after 2016, it wasn't. This is why there's no economic impact assessments. But although the government can hide the truth of what is to come, they will find it rather harder to hide it once it's happened. Once it's data there, once they can't say, oh, it's not very reliable, it's like, this has actually now happened. Imagine what this pattern is going to look like in a few years' time. But those are my thoughts. I may add to them tomorrow. But until then, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.